In this video, we'll be talking about psychological therapies. This is the first video in the set of kind of our overview of the different ways in which psychologists offer therapy. And it is in conjunction with the previous unit or part of the unit that was all about the different disorders. So it's important as we get started here to kind of look at and understand that each of the different perspectives that we've talked about throughout the course of this year actually have their own um, methods of doing therapy. So we're going to start with Freud. We'll get into humanistic therapies, cognitive therapies, behavioral therapies, so let's just dive right in. So of course, I'll let you guys know I love cartoons. That's a good cartoon to get started with. Um, so let's move into the first one, which is Freud. So this image is actually Freud's couch. This is from Vienna. You can see that the patient would lie on the couch there, and the therapist would sit in that green chair to the left of the image, and just record things. Freud's method of therapy is called psychoanalysis. It is this very specific type of therapy. Not all therapies are psychoanalysis, but the psychoanalysis is a type of therapy. And going back to the what's it called? The like iceberg model of our consciousness, right? Freud thinks that everything that is important in our lives is occurring in our unconscious, right? That's creating the anxiety reactions and other defense mechanisms. So understanding what's going on in the unconscious is of paramount importance for practitioners of psychoanalysis. So let's remember, right, just generally a few things, and I'm going to move quickly through some of this stuff. We know that the ego is trying to moderate the conflicts between the id and the superego. We know that there's the belief of repression, especially childhood traumatic experiences and memories that then gets buried in the unconscious that eventually, as Freud would say, would need to get worked out. And it is the job of the psychologist or the psychoanalyst to pull the unconscious information into the conscious mind so that it can be resolved, right? You want to deal with the anxiety that you feel from when you were toilet training, for example, so that you can understand how to move forward in your lives. So the goal of psychoanalysis is to unearth the past, to unmask the present, right? To understand what's going on in your past, right? Literally digging it up from the surface to then realize what's going on with you today. And how does that happen? Usually through a process called free association. So one of the things that that would happen in a typical psychoanalysis session is as the therapist sits outside of you and you're just kind of laying on the couch, they would just tell you to talk, to just speak however you'd like and bring up any topics you want. And the job for the psychologist in this case is not to write down what you're saying. Instead, they're going to write down things that you kind of filter yourself at, right? When we're given just kind of free reign to talk, there are some things that like we won't get into, right? You might find yourself drifting into a tangent and be like, oh no, that's okay, I don't want to go there, and then tie it back. When you bring it back, the psychoanalyst will mark what that topic was that you don't want to deal with, right? That you're trying to avoid. That then would show, according to Freud and psychoanalysts, that there's resistance there, that that's a sign of repression, that you're consciously or unconsciously steering away from a topic because of the unwanted feelings that associates with it. So this is where the psychoanalyst will look at defense mechanisms, looks at other forms of anxiety, and will ultimately, over time, try to pull some of those things into your conscious mind so that you can then deal with them appropriately, right? So again, we kind of have this level. You have this intrapsychic conflict, right? Id, ego, superego, that produces anxiety, which causes us to rely on defense mechanisms. So one of the other ways that psychoanalysis works, besides just free association, is dream interpretation. Freud thought that when we were sleeping, our conscious mind is inactive, which is true, and that our unconscious has free reign. So telling Freud about what's going on in your dreams he would then interpret those to have meaning around your defense mechanisms or the conflicts that you don't want to think about. Psychoanalysis also really focuses on your earliest childhood memories, right? That the thought process is that trauma happens early and then just kind of continuously builds on itself throughout your life. So dealing with the earliest childhood memories that you have, the the more likelihood you're going to have of success. In psychoanalysis and actually most therapies, there's an issue of transference. Transference from a Freudian perspective basically means that you're going to take whatever you're feeling anxiety about and put that onto the therapist, right? So Freud would say that this is, you're feeling anxious about, your parents or something, that they caused some trauma when you were little. You're then going to basically treat your therapist like you would treat your parents. And that you are transferring onto them this the feelings that you have unconsciously. Um, the flip side of this is since Freud was very much interested in sexual feelings and sexual desire, he thought basically that most of his patients wanted to sleep with him, at least in some aspect, right? That they were transferring some of that sexual anxiety onto him, and then he became kind of an infatuation point with some of his clients. So he was warning future psychoanalysts to be aware of that and not to do it. Right? He wasn't saying go for it. He was saying not to do it. Um, and what's interesting about psychoanalysis, as we probably know, is it's not really proven. It doesn't. There's no clinical background to psychoanalysis, right? Just like how there's not much that shows that repression is real. Well, if repression doesn't exist, then all of psychoanalysis is pretty much done with. So we have to be aware that all of these theories have their positives and minuses, right? All these perspectives have things that work for them and things that don't. Just because there's no proof here doesn't necessarily mean that psychoanalysis is bad. Um, any type of therapy, any type of talk therapy is better than none if you're going through a crisis. So even if it's not for you, even if it's not backed in science, just the process of talking things out, having a neutral sounding board, most people find really helpful. Even if that's not going to uncover some deep, dark secret about yourself, it's just helpful to kind of have that in a therapy setting. Now, some actual drawbacks is psychoanalysis takes a really, really long time. Some people normally don't get any diagnosis or anything from their psychoanalyst until like the couple hundred sessions, so 400 or 500 sessions sometimes it seems. And at a couple $100 a pop, that's a lot of money. It's very expensive. So as is all therapy. So it's important as we move forward to think about what therapies are proven, what's the evidence behind them, and that's kind of the theme that we're going to look at is what we'll call evidence-based practices. At the same time, if we're talking about psychoanalysis, we should also mention the psychodynamic therapy, which is similar to Freud's, but it looks more at relationships as opposed to early childhood traumas. So it's more similar to like Adler, who was a proponent of this, and Karen Horney, who was also a proponent of this, as opposed to focusing on like sexual traumas or childhood traumas. And then the goal again is still just kind of to talk openly, and then the therapist kind of focuses on these themes that run across different relationships. The benefit of psychodynamic therapy is it's face to face. You're not just staring off into the void where the therapist sits outside of you, but you're actually having a frequent conversation. You don't need to go necessarily every week. Short sessions are shorter and therefore also relatively inexpensive compared to its more expensive and time consuming cousin, psychoanalysis. So a lot of people actually really like psychodynamic therapy because it provides them in a talk therapy just a supportive person, someone who can kind of say like who can notice different themes and give you some homework, right, things to deal with. We also know that there's something called interpersonal psychotherapy, which is really good for depression. Again, it's based on a lot of talking and talk therapy, but it really helps kind of understand your role in a connection of others, right? Interpersonal between people, and therefore that helps kind of alleviate some of the major symptoms of depression. So let's move on to another type of talk therapy, and that's humanistic therapy. So this is Carl Rogers again. And if you're thinking back to your notes, you know that this is going to emphasize self-fulfillment, right? That this is going to talk about actualizing your potential and reducing any sort of impediments to your development, right? We want to make sure that people flourish and not are constantly dealing with struggles. So, some major differences between psychoanalysis and humanistic therapy. One, uh, humanistic therapies typically focus on your present and your future as opposed to your past, right? What's happened has happened, but how do we create a situation where you can thrive, right? How you can grow. Consciousness over unconsciousness, right? Not too concerned about the things going on in the deep recesses of your mind, but more concerned about how you're understanding your place in the world. And an idea that we should take responsibility and of ourselves and grow over curing an illness that someone might have, right? That there's always this possibility of growth, and that this changes. And this all gets started with Rogers. Rogers started what was called client-centered therapy, which looked at the patients not as ill or as deserving, you know, medical treatment necessarily, but focuses more on their growth as a person, right? Calling them clients makes it feel more equal in a way, as opposed to doctor and patient, right? It feels almost more like a business relationship, right? That one is based on equal footing. So how does this actually work? So Rogers client-centered therapy obviously deals with unconditional positive regard, right? We talked about this in the personality unit, that you just have to treat people with acceptance. You have to understand where they're trying to understand where they're coming from and accept that what they're feeling is valid, right? It's giving them validation in some way. Major components here are empathy. It's non-directive. It's active listening, right? The therapist doesn't come in with an agenda. They allow the client to dictate where the therapy session will go. Active listening is really important here too. So it's not a passive thing, being a humanistic therapist or a Rogerian therapist. It is very active. You're asking follow-up questions. You're asking for clarification. And the goal is to try to create that self-concept, right? That is congruent, that you understand who you are, and that is actually how other people see you as well. So to have a little I don't even know what you would call this, just diagram, I guess, right? So if people believe that their affection from others is conditional, right? That they're only going to be accepted if they do certain things, then you're going to distort your shortcomings to feel worthy, right? You're going to ignore or hype up, in some ways, one way or the other, how your shortcomings to either overcompensate or to struggle through them. That creates that bad self-concept that we talked about. That causes anxiety, and then we have defensive behaviors to protect that inaccurate self-concept, which is why, from the Rogerian perspective, you need to be treated with unconditional positive regard. I have examples of this, videos that we'll watch in class, that will tie all this together. So, keep an eye on Schoology for those. But they are. It's important to kind of get how this all works together. Moving on, let's talk cognitive therapy. So, humanistic therapy is all about growth and self-actualization. Psychoanalysis is all about dealing with unconscious anxieties. Cognitive therapy is all about how we think, because how we think colors how we feel, right? It's the difference between being excited at a roller coaster and being afraid of a roller coaster, right? The only difference is the way that we think about it ourselves. So we need to realize that, like, between the thing that exists and our response is our mind, right? That we are in control, and if we can change the way that we think, we can change the way that we feel. So cognitive therapy is really devoted to teaching people new ways of thinking. Instead of having like negative self-talk or a focus on all your negatives, right? Try to think about the positives in situations, right? You're given techniques to work on to improve the way that you think about things like, say, anxiety. We talked about this a little bit in stress. If you see a test as something that is producing anxiety, if you just reframe that as, oh, this is an exciting opportunity for me to prove what I know, that's the only difference is a cognitive flip, right? The only difference is that you're changing the way that you think about something. So when we talk about cognitive therapies, at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about: changing the way that we think about whatever it is that's causing us issues. So there are actually two main types that we should understand. First is Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy, which basically says that we start with changing the thinking, that then will change behavior, that behavior then gets changed, that then leads to new reinforcements, right? That then strengthen the thought changes that then can continue to lead in a feedback loop to improvement. So this works really well for someone with, say, obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Relabeling the obsessions to understand, like, yeah, there are germs all around me, but that's okay, right? I've lived this long; it's not going to, whatever. Just talking to yourself, changing your self-talk is a major component of rational emotive behavior therapy. On the other hand, you have Beck. Beck's cognitive therapy. He's basically the founder of this field at University of Pennsylvania. He's excellent in understanding the way that we think about things. So um, you know, if you're struggling with something, whether that's depression, anxiety, whatever, we always expect the worst, right? When you're in those headspaces, you can't help but always see the negative, right? You can't help but always assume that negative things are going to happen. And then when those negative things do happen, it's just, well, it's because I'm horrible, I'm not good enough. So Beck challenges his patients to think of more optimistic ways of thinking, right? Develop more of a positive outlook. That positive outlook changes the way that we talk to ourselves, and we can say things like, oh no, that's our anxiety talking, right? Or, oh no, that's my depression talking. That I can basically separate who I am, the way that I think, from my illness, right? I can be in a very anxious moment and be like, oh, I'm feeling this way because my anxiety is ruling what I'm dealing with, as opposed, and then just that simple act of reframing can actually alleviate your anxiety, right? Because now it doesn't have control over you, right? By naming it, you kind of put it outside of yourself, and then that gives you the ability to address it, right, and combat it. And this is really, really good for depression. Cognitive therapy, specifically Beck's cognitive therapy, is great for depression, because when we are in a depressed state, right, all of our self-talk is negative. All of our self-talk is negative. So by going through a cognitive therapy session, a la Beck, that allows us to understand that those negative thoughts are just the illness, and that's separate from us, and that we can overcome them. Um, that's a lot for this video so far. So I think I'll cut it here, and we'll pick back up with group therapy, behavioral therapies, and then we'll talk a little bit about how do we evaluate therapy in general, right? What are the positives and negatives here? So in this video, we went over psychoanalysis, the Freudian therapy tactic that seeks to resolve the unconscious issues that are going on in our unconscious mind through acts of free association, dream interpretation, those kinds of things that bring the unconscious mind to the surface. We looked at humanistic therapy, which is all about self-actualization and treating people with unconditional positive regard and acceptance, which is mainly characterized by active listening. And then we have cognitive therapies, which help us reframe the way that we view ourselves in the world by changing the way we think. So next video, as I said, group therapy, behavioral therapy, and evaluating therapies as a whole. And I will see you at that next video. Take care.